Hello, my name's Anna Wilkinson, and I'm a professor of animal cognition at the University of Lincoln. And today I'm going to tell you about my research in cold-blooded cognition, which is understanding the, the cognitive abilities of reptiles. So I'm interested in how animals see the world, how they remember things, how they use this information, and how it impacts the decisions that they make. And generally, most of this work is done with mammals and birds, and we're starting to get a really good understanding of that. But actually, we know very little about the other amniotic class, reptiles. So that's what I'm going to tell you about today. And I'm also hopefully going to give you an idea of why this matters. Okay, so first of all, let's think about what is cognition. The cognition is a term which we refer to the mental processes involved in gaining knowledge. So that might be perceiving, things like hearing, seeing, feeling something, learning. So that's learning about your different experiences, being able to remember them, and then using that sort of information when we make decisions. And of course, we as humans do this all the time. But what do we know about this in non-human animals? Well, generally, when we think about intelligence in animals, people mostly focus on primates, non-human primates, particularly ones which are more similar to us, and also on dogs. So there's lots of evidence of dogs in the media where dogs do remarkable things to help humans. And because of that, people think that they are somehow special in their intelligence. And what we see with dogs is that they're very, very good at using human cues, but maybe they're not quite as sophisticated as we might think. So when we do have animals that we perceive as clever, we somehow want to treat them in a way which is better for them. So if we have a dog, we don't want it to get bored. We do want it to get exercise. We do want it to have varied environments. And so it's really important that we think about what abilities do other animals have that we keep in captivity to make sure we can provide the very best experiences for them as our pets, for example. So if you take the example, you know the phrase, they've got a memory like a fish, okay? That fish have something like 3-second memory. Now, this is a complete myth. There's lots of really nice evidence on fish cognition, and they actually have remarkable abilities. And there's a lovely paper which has shown that they can remember for 3 months. So if you think about that in terms of their care, so you can see these fish, they're in a classic fish bowl with one little bit of weed and some gravel. Now, if you think an animal can remember for just 3 seconds, you wouldn't worry too much about keeping it in that environment. However, if you know that this animal can remember for 3 months, that this animal can discriminate between others of the same species, and various other really important factors of their cognition, I would hope that it would make you think, well, maybe we need to give them something more challenging in their environment and better conditions in which to live. So now let's focus on reptiles. Well, reptiles have traditionally been considered to be sort of sluggish, inert, and unresponsive. And that's a direct quote from a scientific paper. And because of that, very little consideration has been given to their welfare in captivity. Now, this idea arose from in the sort of probably about 50 years ago now. There was a really big trend towards trying to understand cognition of other species. And reptiles were tested in inappropriate conditions. So you would have, say, a tropical species of reptile. If it's tested in a cold room, these animals are cold-blooded, so they rely on their environmental temperature to allow them to perform certain behaviors. And because of that, they didn't do very much. And so because of that, they were sort of labeled as being sort of these non-intelligent creatures. And what I hope to show you today is that our research has revealed that they are anything but this, and that they actually have quite remarkable cognitive abilities. So I'm going to give you a little run through of different aspects of cognition and talk about what we found with them and then why they matter. So let's think about spatial navigation. Well, spatial cognition is considered to be an essential survival tool, as it allows an animal to navigate through complex natural environments. So if you think about a challenge within a home range that an animal might have, we know that animals will need to, if we're a reptile, need to find a basking area, need to move efficiently from one foraging site to another foraging site, and to avoid food sites where supplies have been depleted and move on to new ones, and then return at appropriate time periods. So you can see how just this basic requirements for the animals to survive actually involves a whole load of different cognitive tasks. Now, in terms of mammal spatial navigation, we know that they use the hippocampus in order to remember where they've been and judge how to get back to where they've come from. But reptiles have a medial cortex, which is a different brain structure, which looks to be structurally similar to the hippocampus, but very little work had been done on the behavioral testing of that. So can they perform these complex cognitive tasks that we know that mammals do? So we wanted to investigate this, and we used red-footed tortoises to do so. So red-footed tortoises are tropical tortoises. They come from Central and South America. And what's really good about them is they're pretty active, which is great. And they're also very food motivated. And so in our research, we like to reward our animals with some favorite food in order to get them to do the task that we wanted them to do. And so, of course, you need to have an animal that's food motivated. If you have a snake that eats once a month, this can be more challenging. You need to think about other ways that you can work with them. So what we did was we ran tortoises in a radial arm maze. Now, this is considered to be a complex maze. So what you have is it's like a bike spoke. So you have a central platform where you place your animal, and then the animal can move up and down the different arms. At the end of every single arm, there is some food. Now, the food's hidden, so they can't see it in advance, but if they can learn about where they've been, they will know where the arms that they shouldn't revisit. Okay? And so we trained, in this case, this was with one tortoise, but we've now replicated this with lots of other tortoises to actually navigate around a maze. And this is what the tortoise was up to. So this is Moses, the tortoise. And you might think that this is slightly speeded up. This is actually speeded up 28 times, this video, okay? So it isn't a hugely fast procedure. It does take a long time working with these animals. However, even though tortoises are slow moving, they actually do move fairly continually. Whereas if you run something like this with lizards, you'll get them to run very fast and then they stop and they watch and then they move. So the tortoises actually are faster than the lizards at doing this sort of task. And you can see that Moses completed the maze. And this is something which we've looked at a number of times. And we found overall that tortoises can learn to navigate around a complex maze. And it seems that they use visual cues to do this. So visual cues in their surrounding area, they can use these in order to learn about where they've been and where they haven't been yet. And they don't use any sort of spurious cues. So in this case, we use strawberries as the odor, as the reward. And we also had to check and make sure that they weren't just using the odor of the strawberries in order to solve the task. So we know that they use visual cues in their environment when they can. But actually, when we remove those visual cues around them, what we find is they use this really nice sort of rule-based strategy, which in a radial arm maze works really well. And that's simply to go into the arm next to the one that you have just been in. And of course, if you're doing that, that's really easy on the memory load. You don't have to remember too much. You need to remember the direction of turn. And it means you can also have really high accuracy. So when the tortoises started to do that, we wanted to look at whether they could, what they'd learned about when they were using these simple rules, and could they translate that to other contexts? So what we did was we trained tortoises to use a touchscreen, and tortoises actually readily learn to do this. So what we did was initially we presented them with a red triangle. They learned to peck this for a food reward. And then we presented them with a really simple spatial discrimination. So depending on the tortoise, they had to always learn to choose the left-hand blue circle or the right-hand blue circle, depending on the animal. Okay? And so they had to learn a simple spatial rule. And we were really interested not only in can they learn this, but we were really interested to see if they could learn this spatial information, can they translate that to another environment? A little bit like we would on a map. So you have a map which presents you with visual information, which represents a spatial task. right? And you can look on the map, you can work out where you want to go, and then you can translate that into your real life travel. And that's what we did with the tortoises. So we trained them on the touchscreen initially, okay? We trained them to do this leftward side or rightward, depending on the animal. And then we put them in a big arena where they had 2 blue food bowls. And we looked to see whether they selected the food bowl which was on the same side as the blue circle that they'd already been trained to touch. So this is the tortoise's performance in the on the touchscreen. Okay, this is Esme the tortoise. And what you can see, she's pecking the red triangle, and then she's a left-sided tortoise. So she then pressed the left button and she got a food reward. And here she is again doing the same thing. Okay, and actually tortoises really rapidly learn to use a touchscreen. Tortoises can learn to use a touchscreen faster than dogs can. So they are really, really good at this sort of task. We then put them in the big arena and we said, can you translate this to a different environment? And we found that they could. So they translated this information back to a real life arena where they had to move through the environment. And that was really exciting because it says that they're learning something quite complex in terms of their cognition and not very simple arbitrary rules that only work in one specific context. We then gave them a break and we tested them 3 months later in the touchscreen to see if they could remember this information. And we found that they could. So we found that not only could they translate information from a touchscreen into an arena that they moved through the space, but they could remember that for 3 months, which is an incredibly long time when you think about it. So this got us really interested in actually what is the length of time that these animals are able to learn for. So we set up a series of experiments to look at exactly that. So what we did was we trained tortoises that some arbitrary coloured card, so it's really just big colour cues, were linked to different reward outcomes. Okay, so in this case, we had mango jelly, and we had it in 2 different sizes. So we had the turquoise card, in this case, was linked to a big bit of mango jelly. So if they touched the turquoise card, that's what they received. If they touched the purple card, they received a small bit of mango jelly. And funnily enough, we found that they could learn this. And then we looked to see where their preferences were. So were they able to, did they prefer the stimulus associated with the large food reward? And we found that they did. So when we gave them a choice between the turquoise and the purple, we found that they went for the turquoise, the one which was associated with the big food. Even more interestingly, is we found that they were willing to work much harder for that larger reward. So we put them in an arena with sand. These were quite little tortoises. They had to walk through, and they would walk past the purple one and walk much further to get to the turquoise cue card and then get that larger reward. So we've shown that the tortoises can do this. They can learn to associate arbitrary cues with an outcome, and that they'll work harder for the better outcomes. Now we thought, actually, because what we've got here is the different sizes of jellies could give different energetic amounts to the animals. So we also wanted to test them on some preferences which actually didn't give them any better energy value to see if they were still able to do this. And so what we did was we presented them with other coloured cue cards, which were associated either with mango jelly, one of their absolute favourites, if I've said, or apple jelly, which they are very much less keen on, but they are still willing to eat. Okay, and we then did exactly the same thing. We looked to see which one they were more likely to choose. And what you can see in this diagram is the positions in which we presented the cue cards. So sometimes they could be the same distance, sometimes one could be forward, and sometimes one could be further backwards. And what we found was no matter what position the cue cards were presented in, the animals had a strong preference for both the higher quantity, so the larger amount, and the higher quality, so the mango jelly. Okay? And after we found that they were able to do that, we wanted to see how long they were able to retain this information. And we thought that this is really important because when tortoises are looking for food in the wild, okay, if they have preferences for different foods, does that last over a season? So tortoises, because they are more slow moving than something like a bird that can fly across and look at fruiting tree, look for which trees are fruiting, tortoises can't do that. So if they make errors, they're going to be much more costly to those animals. So we gave them a retention interval of 18 months. So it was 18 months after we initially did this training that we then tested them to see if they still had a preference. And what we found on that test was that they did. They exhibited exactly the same preferences as they had exhibited initially when we trained the animals on it. So what does this tell us? Well, it can tell us that reptiles are able to remember for a long time. And you can see why this is important in nature. Because these animals are required to search for fruit. They need high quality food, this species does. And actually the costs of getting it wrong could be really high. And so by being able to remember across fruiting seasons, it gives them a real head start and is likely to really improve their fitness and their likelihood of survival. But let's think about how that translates to them living in a captive environment, just like we were thinking with the fish at the beginning. So the fact that they can remember for 18 months, it tells us that they'd be able in their captive experience to remember different types of information, both good and bad, for a long time. So the good aspects of this is that if you give them a nice large enclosure that they can move about in, they can remember important things. They'll be able to remember where to find the water, where to find the shelter, all really crucial things for their well-being. But equally, it means if they have a bad experience, they will also remember that for a long time. So, for example, if they have a bad experience in terms of their care, or also really necessary but potentially not pleasant experience like vet trips, are going to be remembered for a long time. So again, it's really important that when we have these animals, we keep them well. And if they are going to be required to go for vet visits, we try and make it as positive for the animal as we possibly can. Okay, so that's sort of talking to you about sort of their spatial learning and their memory. Now, another super important aspect of cognition is what we call social learning. So social learning is being able to learn from the behavior of another individual. And this is thought to be really adaptive as it provides a shortcut to new information. So as humans, we use social learning all the time. So I'm doing social learning through teaching now. I'm providing you with information and you're absorbing information. And this information for me to provide to you is much, much easier than for you to go and run all these studies yourselves and acquire that information yourselves. So it's a really phenomenal shortcut to new and important information. This is also really important for animals as well. So, for example, if there's a new food source, if another individual is eating from it, it might be more likely that it's edible and that you could eat from it as well. It might simply be that the position of another individual draws your attention to food that you hadn't seen before. So even in very simple forms, you can see how social learning can be incredibly powerful. So we wanted to investigate this in reptiles. Now, it's never been observed in reptiles before. And generally, at the time when we did this work, it was really considered to be only animals which really had high-level cognition would be able to learn from observing the behavior of another individual. But we wanted to look to see if this ability was available in this case, in tortoises. Now, most of the work up until this point was with primates or birds, which could manipulate things very cleverly with their beaks. And so actually using a setup which could work well with the tortoises was quite challenging. So what we did was we created what is called a detour task. So we had a V-shaped fence that you can see in the diagrams up there. The tortoise started on one side, and then on the inside, there was food reward. And the aim was that the tortoise would have to go all of the way round the detour to get to the food. Now, we had two different conditions for this. So we had what we call a control group, and the control group just got the opportunity to learn about it. Because we can't say something social learning unless we can prove that the animals who can see a demonstrator are actually better at it than the animals would be anyway. So in our control group, what we had a tortoise was put in a little cage. It was held in there for a short period of time. And then it got released into the environment and got the opportunity to try and navigate around that detour to get the food. And then we also had a social learning group. And in this group, what we had the tortoise was in the little cage at the beginning, just like in the control group. But what was crucially different is that they saw another tortoise make this detour around the fence and get access to the food. And they then got an option to have a go themselves. And so this is what we found. So I'm sorry about the quality of these videos. They're quite dark, but if you look closely, what you'll see that we're going to put a tortoise in the little cage, and then we release that tortoise. So the tortoise goes in the cage, it gets to spend some time in there, and then we release the tortoise. And what does it do? Well, this is a control group. This is the first trial of one of the tortoises in the control group. And we found that basically what she did was she then went and pushed against the V-shaped fence, trying to get directly through to get access to the food. Okay, each tortoise got a number of trials, and we basically found that all of the animals in the control group, they basically did this for the first sort of 5 or so goes at it, and then they went up the side and then they fell asleep in the corner. And we found that not a single animal in the control group was able to solve this task. We then trained one of the tortoises to be a demonstrator for our social learning group of tortoises. So we trained her how to make that detour, how to go around and get the food. And this took 6 weeks. So at this point, we were getting kind of concerned about it. And this is clearly an incredibly difficult task for the animals. So what this video shows you is the very first trial of one of the animals in the social learning group. And what you will see is he will be put under the little cage. He will then watch one of the tortoises, one of our demonstrators, Wilhelmina, go around the detour, and then he gets the opportunity to complete it himself. So there we go. We got tortoise in the cage, and this is our demonstrator tortoise doing a beautiful detour. And now the question is, what does our observer tortoise do? Well, initially, he sets off just like we saw with the control animals, but then he moved around and completed the task. And this is the very first time that animal had had the opportunity. We found that every single tortoise in the social learning group was able to complete the task. And just to remind you that none of the animals in the control group were able to do it. So this shows quite how powerful social learning is. So what are the implications of that? Well, we've shown that tortoises are able to learn to access an otherwise inaccessible reward by observing the behavior of a conspecific or another tortoise. And we've shown that it provides a shortcut to new information. But if we think about it, this has really important implications in terms of the welfare as well. So it shows a really phenomenally high level of cognition, which we didn't think that something like a tortoise would be capable of. So of course, that comes with the idea that we need to keep them in a cognitively complex environment as well, to give them those sorts of challenges that they are able to cope with in nature. It also shows us that, that they can learn from the behavior of another individual. Now, many reptile species may be largely solitary, and often they're kept in isolation in captivity. Now, this doesn't mean that you should keep reptiles with lots of other individuals necessarily. because there could be issues with that. You can often get aggression. You need maybe very large areas. Other species can get on very, very well in captivity, but we do need to think about the social environment and how we can access that. So potentially one way to do that, if you can't keep an animal together, is potentially to provide something like a photograph of another individual, which that animal could choose to approach or could choose to move away from. Not one which is invading all its space, but one which gives it that option for it. Okay, brilliant. And so the final study that I want to tell you about is one where we actually looked how the environment in which an animal lives impacts its cognition. And this study was done with snakes. So what we had was we kept snakes in either standard environment. So this would be a standard vivarium. They would have everything that they needed, but they wouldn't have a lot of the enrichment which we might want to see in there. Then we had the enriched environment where animals had everything that the standard kept animals had, but they also had things like branch that they could climb up. They had a pegboard that they could crawl on. They had different hanging hides and a choice of hides. And we wanted to look at how that affected their welfare. And what we saw that in the enriched animals, we saw a real more variety of behaviors. So they were able to express more behaviors in an enriched environment than they were in a standard environment, which is, of course, incredibly important when we're thinking about meeting the needs of those animals. We also did what's called a preference test, where we looked to see what they preferred. And we found that the animals preferred the enriched environment over the standard environment when they were given a choice. But the study I want to tell you about more is how this impacted their cognition. So what we did was we presented the snakes with two different odors, one of which was the odor of a familiar person, so their handlers, and the other of which was an odor of an unfamiliar person. And we wanted to see the impact that enrichment had on potentially recognition of familiar individuals. So what we did was, after housing the animals in these environments for 4 weeks, we presented the snakes in an arena, just like we would do with the tortoises, two different odors, and they had a certain amount of time to go and explore those odors. And what we found was quite remarkable. So we found that the animals, when they were housed in the standard environment, they didn't display any differences in the amount of time they spent with either of the odors. However, the animals that were housed in the enriched environment did. So they were able to discriminate between the odors, and they actually spent more time with the odor of the novel individual. Now, this is really important for a couple of reasons. It tells us that that environment in which our animals are living in can impact their cognition and their ability to express their cognitive abilities. And so if we keep animals in more barren environment, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that we say, oh, well, they are stupid. They are sluggish, inert, unresponsive. The quote I gave you at the very beginning, because maybe they're not able to then express their abilities. But if you keep them in more complex, enriched environments, they not only are able to perform more behaviors and prefer it, they're also able to show their remarkable cognitive abilities. And it's also really important. So the reason we used familiar and unfamiliar people is because we were really interested to see how that impacted the recognition and the potential human-animal bond. So if we can say by keeping them in this enriched environment, your snake will actually be able to recognize you, it's likely to improve that relationship that the owner has with their animal. Okay, so that's all of the studies that I wanted to tell you about today. But I hope what I've shown you is that there is remarkable evidence of complex cognition in reptiles. And this is really important for our understanding of the evolution of cognition. But it's also really important to consider in light of the care which we give to pet reptiles or to reptiles in captivity. We show that reptiles can and do learn to navigate around space. We've shown that they're able to learn from others and they're able to remember their experiences for a long time. And so the design of the enclosures and the husbandry regimes that we create for animals should therefore reflect this. So I'd just like to leave you with my very favourite quote, that the physical sluggishness and awkwardness of the turtle may have earned him an undeserved reputation for stupidity. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, then please let me know. I'm going to stop sharing the slides now so that I can see what's going on. Okay, so thank you all very much. I hope you found that was useful. And if you do have any questions, do feel free to email me. My email is awilkinson@lincoln.ac.uk. Thank you. Bye-bye.